You know, when you think of a broken hip, a femoral neck fracture, you probably picture your grandparents, right? A slip, a fall. But what happens when that exact same injury hits someone young and active? Well, it's not just a broken bone anymore. It becomes this high-stakes race against the clock to save their own hip and protect their entire future of mobility. So what makes this injury so incredibly dangerous for a young person?
And that's the core question, isn't it? It's a total paradox. For an older person, the goal is often about managing frailty and getting them back on their feet. But for a young person, this is about salvaging their strength, their activity, their life as they know it. The stakes are just on a completely different level. So, why is this a totally different ballgame in someone under, say, 50? It really comes down to two big things. First, how the bone breaks, and second, what we're desperately trying to accomplish with the surgery. And just look at the kind of damage we're talking about here. For an elderly person, a simple fall from standing can cause this. But in a young adult with dense, strong bones, oh no, it takes an incredible amount of force. We're talking serious car accidents, falls from a height. That high-energy impact just creates a much more complicated and, frankly, a much scarier injury.
This right here sums it up perfectly. It's like two completely different stories for the same injury. In an older patient, a hip replacement, an arthroplasty, is often the best move. It gets them mobile fast. But for a young person who has decades of running, jumping, and living to do, a replacement is the absolute last resort. The goal, the only goal, really, is to save their natural hip.
So why is it so hard to save the hip? It all boils down to one critical life or death factor: the blood supply. This isn't just a simple plumbing issue, it's a full-on vascular crisis happening right inside the hip joint.
And here is the main villain of our story: avascular necrosis, or AVN. When that femoral neck snaps, it can tear the tiny, delicate arteries that feed the top of the femur bone, the femoral head, and without blood, the bone tissue just dies. It starves. This is, without a doubt, the complication that keeps surgeons up at night.
And get this, the risk of that femoral head dying from AVN after one of these fractures is somewhere between 12% and a staggering 86%. That massive, terrifyingly wide range is exactly why this is considered a true surgical emergency.
So you've got this ticking clock. The bone's life support system is failing. The surgeons have to get in there and fix it. But how do you stabilize a shattered piece of bone while also giving its fragile blood supply the absolute best chance to heal?
All right, this brings us to the surgeon's toolkit, and the choice of which piece of hardware to use isn't just a matter of preference, it's dictated by the physics of the break itself.
This is called the Powell's classification, and it's a super important roadmap for the surgeon. Basically, it sorts fractures by their angle. Think of it like a ramp. The steeper that ramp, the more vertical the break, like a type 3, the more unstable it is. The forces are trying to shear it apart, not push it together to heal. And guess what we see in those high-energy traumas in young people? A lot of these unstable, high-shear fractures.
Now, to fight those powerful shear forces, surgeons really have two main playbooks. On the left, you've got cannulated screws, basically several strong screws to pin the pieces together. On the right, you have what's called a fixed angle device. This is more like a heavy-duty bracket with a big screw and a plate designed for maximum stability.
Okay, so that sets up the million-dollar question. Which one is better? The collection of screws or the big, rigid plate and screw construct? Let's take a look at what the evidence actually says. Well, in a massive study of over 600 young patients, the results were pretty eye-opening. The overall failure rate, and by failure, we mean the implant broke, the bone didn't heal, it needed another surgery, that rate was way lower for the fixed-angle devices. We're talking a 40% failure rate versus 60% for the screws. That is a huge difference.
But here's where the plot thickens, because it's not quite that simple. While the fixed-angle devices had a better overall success rate, if you drill down into the specifics, the picture gets a little fuzzy. In this study, the screws actually had a slightly lower rate of the dreaded AVN, but a much higher rate of non-union. That's when the bone just flat out refuses to heal. It shows that surgeons are always playing the odds, making a calculated trade-off.
So this brings us to a really crucial point. While the type of implant is obviously important, it's not the only thing that matters, not by a long shot. A successful outcome depends on so much more than just the hardware. This quote from a landmark paper in the field just says it all. Anatomic reduction. What does that mean? It means putting the broken pieces of the puzzle back together perfectly to restore the bone's original shape. At the end of the day, the skill of the surgeon in lining everything up is probably the single most important factor for success.
And the research totally backs this up. The things that best predict a bad outcome aren't just about the implant. It's the quality of that alignment, how badly the bone was displaced in the first place, and something the patient has to control, putting weight on it too soon. You can have the best implant in the world, but if these other things go wrong, it can still fail.
So, if we put it all together, the experts have basically created a 5-step playbook for giving a young person the best possible shot at saving their hip. It all starts with diagnosing it fast and getting into surgery urgently. Then, the surgeon has to get that perfect anatomic reduction. They might also do something called a capsular decompression, making a little hole to relieve pressure from bleeding inside the joint, which can help the blood supply. And finally, lock it all down with a stable fixation. That is the recipe for success.
But even with a perfect surgery, the journey isn't quite over. The hip is saved, but for how long? That initial traumatic event and the risk of even a small amount of that bone death we talked about, the AVN, can set the stage for arthritis down the road. It really highlights the ultimate takeaway here. For a young person with a broken hip, success isn't just about what screw or plate you use. It's about a perfectly timed, perfectly executed repair that gives their own hip the very best chance to last a lifetime.